Greetings, everybody. I'm Chris Hislop. I'm the Executive Director from the Montana World Affairs Council, and welcome to another of the Brownbag series. Special thanks, of course, to the University of Montana and the Central and Southwest Asian Studies program here, who co-hosts this series of Brownbag lunches together with the Montana World Affairs Council. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction of myself and the organization, and then quickly hand over to Bob and Tiff on today's topic. But I am very fortunate to have arrived here in Missoula just under 2 years ago, after about a 20-year career overseas working on international relations with the United Nations and some nonprofits on humanitarian issues and humanitarian diplomacy. And so for me, it was really wonderful to have a very soft landing here in Missoula to meet people like yourselves and so many people in this community who are so interested in engaging the world. And that's exactly what the Montana World Affairs Council does. Our mission is to foster engagement among Montana's students, including university students and communities, on international issues. So we do programs across the state in schools and in communities like this one today to try to engage people on a key issue. It's not simply the issue. We're all trying to get more than that. And what we try to do is answer three simple questions. What, so what, and now what? What are the facts? What is going on in China? Who are the players and what do we know? But you can get that if you read the New York Times. You can get that by reading The Economist. You want something more. We all want something more. We want to know the so what. The so what is, how does this affect us? Why should we care? Why does this matter to me, to my community, to my society, to my state? Why should I be bothered by this? This is a very important question that engages us on these issues. And then the third question is, now what? So after you know what's going on and how it affects you, the now what is, what can be done on this issue? Maybe by you, maybe not by you, maybe by political leaders, maybe by economic leaders and others. But the third question is always the now what? What, after we've learned about this, can and should be done on this issue? And we're so very lucky today to have two real experts talk on China. And I'm not going to give the long introduction because I don't think you want to hear me bleat on about this, but you will want to hear our experts. We're here with Mr. Bob Seidenschwarz, who is the President Emeritus of our organization, the Montana World Affairs Council. And then we're also joined by China expert Tiff Roberts. And you really couldn't have two more expert voices on this issue than these two people. So welcome once again to you who are all here. Welcome to those who have joined on the Zoom link and who are on our Facebook Live link. Thanks a lot for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Bob Seidenschwarz.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Welcome, everybody. It should be worth mentioning that this is also live on Facebook and going over Zoom, as well as being live video stream too. So we may have a significantly larger audience, but welcome to all that are here right now. We are very fortunate to have Dexter Tiff Roberts. His dad was a professor here at the university, so he grew up here in Missoula, Montana, and then found his way to China, where he was the bureau chief for Bloomberg Business Week. So we have somebody that is eminently qualified, not only speaks the language, but spent many years and continues to have intimate connections into China, so that we are going to get a truly live insight as to what's happening inside the country, the ability to read, understand, and decipher the language, which of course is very different when you're looking at it from that perspective versus how we may understand or interpret it. So I want to welcome Tiff Roberts, who is our true expert here on China. So let's get going, since we have a limited amount of time and we want to leave plenty of ample time for questions as well, both from Zoom as well as the audience. When we are finished with the lecture per se, the microphone in the back, please go to that. And let's get started here. So Tiff, what we're going to do is, I just want to very briefly, I prepared 4 slides since it leads into China, an old country, a very big country, just to give people a visual map of China and its surrounding neighbors. This is what I want you to take a quick look at here. Even though China has 1.4 billion people, it's hard to imagine that they have a population problem. And you may be wondering, well, how do you have a population problem with 1.4 billion people? It's because of the allocation of where people fall within the demographics within China. China, like many countries in the world, is growing older. And it's presenting very unique challenges, both socially, politically, and economically. Not unlike what you see in Europe, the United States, and many other industrialized countries. So when you look at this, this is just simply, if you look over here on the left side, the different age categories and the percentage of males and females. So ideally, what you would like to see in a growing, vibrant economy in terms of going forward for a number of years of decades is that bottom part to be the larger part of the bulge and the top part to be the smaller. And one of the reasons is allocation of resources. China is dealing with the issue of how do we provide this ever-growing larger population of elderly people with the security and the resources and support systems that are necessary. So it's not something just unique to China. As I said, it's a global issue. And then this is something too that shows population. And if you look at that arc and you start kind of looking at that where it intersects the dotted line, somewhere out around 2065, population starts declining. And it's not just an estimate of population in China, it's a global population decline that is expected as well. So we're roughly over 9 billion people today. Estimates are we're going to peak somewhere in that 10, possibly 11 billion range, but then decline. And I'll let Tiff give some more insight as to what that actually means in terms of Chinese challenges today and into the future. So I just want to provide that. And then rural population to urban, another very important concept to keep in mind as China has steadily been growing more urban and less rural. And that has implications as well that he will touch on. So just a few things to kind of keep in mind. Han population, minority groups. Han is the predominant ethnicity within China. So let's get started here because I'm just presenting to you just a few factoids that are critical to understanding some of the challenges of present and into the future that the government faces. So welcome, Tiff.
Well, thank you very much, Bob. I don't have prepared remarks today. I would note that this issue of the demographic challenge that China is facing has a new urgency as of earlier this year when the authorities in China released the results of their latest once every decade census. And what they discovered is actually the population is slowing, the growth of the population is slowing much more dramatically than they had realized. The birth rate has fallen dramatically to a point where it is equal to what they saw during this terrible famine that occurred decades earlier during the Great Leap Forward in China. So they responded to this realization that the population is getting smaller and older even faster than they thought with some consternation. It's a big challenge for China going forward, particularly because of the bills that come due as people, as local governments in China that are responsible for social welfare needs, and families themselves have to pay much higher costs to support the healthcare and the pensions of aging relatives.
So for years, all of us have heard about the one-child policy. That is not the official policy anymore, or is it kind of a wink and a nod that what they're encouraging the Chinese citizens to do is get that birth rate up?
Yeah, so they officially ended the one-child policy a couple of years ago. They saw the result initially was a little bit of a birth spike. Some people in the cities mainly having babies, perhaps in the countryside as well, but having children that they hadn't been able to have before. But that quickly disappeared, and there had been hope that that would start to reverse the decline in birth. But what they've discovered, something which is true all around the world, which is as people become better educated and wealthier, they tend to have smaller families. So now they've actually moved towards what people would refer to as a pro-natal policy. They're actually starting to put a little bit of pressure. There's a lot of propaganda and news trying to encourage people to have larger families. And they've done things, for example, like make it a little more difficult to get divorced. They're trying to keep couples together and try to encourage them to have more children.
So, and this goes back to when I'm showing this in terms of urban versus rural, something to keep in mind that you just alluded to. As more wealth is accrued, as populations are going from rural to urban areas, lifestyles change. And the pressures in terms of what that means and the cost of raising children starts to also go up as well. Education, you had mentioned something to me so many times during so many of these lectures about the educational disparities, healthcare, wealth creation. So just a little bit of information about educationally what is happening inside of China as well.
Well, a couple of years ago, actually, it was during the Obama administration, China, an organization called PISA, PISA, does annual global rankings of how nations' children perform on test scores. And China, the numbers that they showed that year, as in previous years, showed that China was doing extremely well in terms of math and a bunch of other science, a bunch of other subjects as well. And at the time, the education secretary, a gentleman named Arne Duncan here in the US, described it as a Sputnik moment, referring back to the Soviet Union and the race to get into space when the Soviet Union put a rocket in space, Sputnik, and the United States was shocked, felt like the country was falling behind. So anyway, Arne Duncan referred to this as a wake-up call. We need to do much better on our education. The thing that was not remarked upon was that the test scores that this international organization, PISA, released were based mainly on the city of Shanghai and a few other large urban areas in China. They indeed have students that have performed extremely well, some of the best in the world in terms of test scores. But what they weren't measuring was rural education in China. And the reality is there is a dramatic disparity between the quality of education, between the costs, the government support for education between the cities and rural China. And if you start looking at rural China, you'll discover that actually there's a very high dropout rate. There are very few, a not so large percentage of rural students actually finish high school, and they aren't doing nearly as well on tests. So there is this dramatic split in education. One last thing I would just say, earlier this year, we saw as part of these rolling crackdowns by the government on the technology sector in China, which I'm sure a lot of you have watched, as well as on private enterprise, they decided to ban for-profit tutoring, private education companies. And it devastated some very successful companies in China, like New Oriental English, and another one called Tall, who had done very, very well. This in part was a recognition that the cost of education was getting higher and higher, and that the public school system, when you look at it on a national basis, is not fully serving all the children of China.
So this is actually a perfect segue in terms of right now, there's some dramatic moments happening in China you allude to with the regulatory, the crackdown, the effect in terms of businesses, the impact and how people are perceiving this. Xi Jinping is, from all outward appearances, attempting to gain what looks like even more control over the private sector. And yet the private sector and the government are intimately entwined, as they are in many places. And there's something happening right now that I want you to discuss, which is Evergrand, the Evergrand Crisis. So how many people have even heard about Evergrand? Just a few folks. This is possibly one of those moments which we refer to in the economic realm as a systemic moment. So would you please give us some background on Evergrand? Why is this so important? And how does this fit within what we see in terms of the policies that are being implemented within China or attempted to?
Well, Evergrand, the company itself, is based in the southern part of China. It's, I believe, the second largest real estate company in China. It is important, but it's more important just as sort of a symbol of larger problems that are spread throughout the real estate sector in China. Real estate sector in China is very important. It's about a quarter of the economy. I think, Bob, you can correct me. I think in the US, we're talking more like 16 to 18%. It's significantly lower. And Evergrand like the larger real estate sector, is heavily indebted. It's borrowed very large amounts of money. And why is that a problem? Well, the leadership in China, in Beijing, for years now has been trying to deal with a growing debt problem, where you have total debt exceeding, by most estimates, 200% of GDP, which is quite high. And we've seen in other situations around the world, that can actually be potentially destabilizing to an economy. So China's been trying to reduce leverage. Evergrande and the larger real estate sector is sort of the poster child of bad debt practices. It's the industry that is the most heavily indebted in China. So Beijing, as part of this campaign to reduce that debt and create a more sustainable economy, has recently decided that they need to deal with the biggest challenge of all, which is debt in the real estate sector. Evergrande has been, again, a poster child of that extreme debt. It owes a lot of money, and it, like a lot of real estate companies in China, is able to keep the cash flow going by requiring or asking home buyers to pay up front. And this is common throughout the industry. So if someone wants to buy an apartment, you pay all the money. They may have just broken ground. There's no apartment. You have to wait a couple of years. And everybody does this in China. But Evergrande has done this so successfully that they have, I think, in 200 different cities, they have huge numbers of property developments that are not built yet, but they've taken the money for it. And they have, by most estimates, over a million home buyers who have bought apartments but have yet to get those apartments. The problem is, if Beijing tells Evergrande that it needs to rein in its debt, they may be forced into a situation where there's a fire sale of their assets, and a lot of the interested parties, the banks that have loaned to them, the companies that have bought bonds from them, including global companies, the contractors that have helped build the apartments for them, and the investors, the common people who have bought the apartments, a bunch of them are going to have to take a haircut, as they say. They're not going to get paid. They're not going to get their apartments, or they're not going to get paid fully for the debts that Evergrande owes.
And if we all remember, 2008, we went through a very similar situation here in the United States. Over leverage, ratios changing in terms of bank loans to make it more accessible. But what we did is we kept buying properties that were continuing to appreciate. Loans were being given on these appreciating properties. And then when the bill came due, that's what Tiff is referring to in terms of the over leverage. About 70% of the Chinese population has their money invested in real estate, as opposed to stocks. We have more people in the US investing in stocks. In China, it's real estate. So to emphasize the importance of how big of an issue this may be. And what the banks have been doing is continuing to lower the ratios, knowing that they were in an over leveraged situation in China. So it's kind of an accommodation that they are trapped by their own behavior. And now things are kind of coming to possibly a tipping point within that country, which is of great concern, because how often have you said one of the greatest concerns of the Chinese government is maintaining civil discourse? Civil unrest is one of their biggest fears.
Yeah, I think so. And so if you look at some of the international media coverage in recent days about Evergrande, you'll see that some analysts have started referring to the possibility of what they call a Lehman Moment. And basically, one institution, in that case Lehman, collapsing, and that leading to widespread financial contagion that spreads throughout the world. I think for a number of reasons, that is not likely to happen with Evergrande in China. The most important being that the financial system is largely and quite firmly still in the hands of the government or the Chinese Communist Party. That means if they want to tell the banks to loan more to Evergrande, if they decide to bail it out, the banks will do that. They're state-owned banks. If the regulators say, Evergrande, you need to hive off all this other business that they have. They were building the world's largest soccer stadium. They are invested in they have a big wealth management products business where they lend out money and people buy their, people buy their wealth management products and in effect loan Evergrande money. So the regulators can tell Evergrand to hive off a bunch of its businesses. So we don't expect a Lehman moment or a widespread financial collapse. What the problem is, what you were just mentioning, is the fact that real estate is so important to the Chinese economy. Much more of a real challenge is a real hit to the economy. Quarter of the economy, again, is from real estate. And really important, a hit to Chinese consumer confidence or Chinese confidence. That could take the form, and it's already taking the form of protests. Right? So we've already got protests happening in cities around China by both people that have bought Evergrand properties and haven't had them delivered yet, and are just starting to realize that they may not be getting those apartments as soon as they thought. And then also people that have bought the wealth management products from Evergrand as well, who are now thinking the guaranteed high returns that Evergrand was paying them are about to end.
And there's a kind of a reality check that we're experiencing here, and it's happening in China, and that's inflation. That's the increase of the price of goods and materials to build these apartment complexes and these homes. So I don't know this as an answer, maybe Tiff does, but if I purchased and fronted up my money a year or two ago, it was based on a certain premise, possibly of what pricing would be. Now I may come back to you and say, sorry, the prices have gone up, not too different than what we've experienced here. Somebody building a house, unless they built in agreement with the builder, they may be facing higher prices as a result of lumber, labor costs, and labor shortages, which is something we're experiencing here in Montana and parts of the country. So that's another factor that's adding in. So on Monday, the market sold off pretty significantly because of this issue. They quieted down a little on Tuesday. They're up today. Why? Because the government came in and said, we will not let them fail. But that alone is no guarantee to what you're alluding to with other entities, internally or externally outside the country. Confidence is a major factor in the relationships that you have with your business and your economic partners. So it's a situation that will continue to unfold, and it has implications both internally and, of course, externally, which brings me to a question: how intertwined is China and the US from a business standpoint? And of course, we know and we continue to hear that China and the US are at odds over a number of different issues. And if you would kind of enlighten us to what several of those may be.
Yeah, so I just say that in terms of financial exposure, China has still a largely closed financial system, and the actual amount of money that banks or institutions overseas have lent into the Chinese economy, sure, it exists, and some institutions will suffer and take a loss, but it's not going to directly bring down big overseas or US financial institutions. The larger economic relationship is deeply entwined, where we're each other's, most of the time, it shifts a little bit sometimes with the EU or the European Union taking a role, but the US and China are either the number one or number two biggest trading partners of each other. The US companies have been one of the biggest investors into the Chinese economy. And really important is the degree to which global supply chains, including crucially global supply chains that US companies are involved in and tied into the US economy, are reliant on China. So as I think most of you know, many of the products that we all have, from our iPhones and to our clothing and our shoes, most of that's made in China. That is a crucial linkage. I think there was a bit of a wake-up call for some people in the US government with the COVID pandemic, when it was discovered that the world's supply of surgical masks and ventilators and other equipment related to healthcare and health protection was being produced in China. So there is this emphasis to try to unwind some of that relationship, but the relationship is extremely close. One last thing I would say, big companies like Apple, like Nike, like General Motors, Intel, the chip maker, Starbucks, McDonald's, all these companies have very significant businesses in China. In many cases, their fastest growing business globally is in China. And so in some cases, their biggest market already is in China. So as you know, again, the two countries deeply integrated. I caution when people talk about decoupling, them to remember the fact that a full-on decoupling means reducing the global importance of American companies. If Americans want to decouple from China, that means Apple, all these ones I just mentioned, Intel, Starbucks. If they actually did reduce their China business, that basically means they're going to make themselves into smaller, less globally important companies.
Or it gets repatriated here, and you may be paying a lot more for the products and services that you have to use. So there's this constant tension that exists in these types of situations. So how do we help the listening audience understand what's rhetoric and what are real differences that exist between the China and the US geopolitically, economically, and socially? Because we often refer to China as authoritarian. Treatment of the Uyghurs, it's other ethnic populations. So we see some of this behavior, it's hard to ignore. So what leverage do we have in terms of making changes, and vice versa? Because they can turn around and say, well, US, you've had your policy issues and you've had mistreatment of people for centuries in terms of certain ethnicities within this country as well. So how do we separate kind of the wheat from the chaff?
I think, first of all, and I hate to say this because I've spent most of my life in China and have deep ties to it, but I think that we minimize the differences at our own risk or peril. I think that particularly when you look at the political systems and you look at what the national goals are through the governments, you will find a dramatic divergence. A lot of this is becoming more apparent, I think, to the rest of the world right now. China has, with its ongoing crackdowns on technology companies, on the private sector, on its richest entrepreneurs, and now with Evergrand, perhaps trying to rein in its real estate market, is quite clearly signaling not just economic priorities, but political priorities. And what are those political priorities? Well, first of all, the most important political priority is to ensure the continued strength and longevity of the Chinese Communist Party. And there is a feeling now in China that in order to maintain the longevity of the Chinese Communist Party, and it's been around since 1921, it's been around a long time already, they need to do certain things. They need to at least signal that they have new priorities. One of those priorities, they say, is to try to make a more equal society. Another priority is to make a much more independent country economically and politically that doesn't necessarily have as close a relationship or relies, as it did in the past, on countries like the United States. And you hear from the General Secretary and President Xi Jinping a lot, an expression which in Chinese is 自力更生, which means self-reliance. And he talks about it, and it's not just rhetoric. I've often said in different situations, I think he's a true believer. I think he actually personally takes very seriously a lot of the goals that were set and the ideologies that became part of the Chinese political system decades ago, even under Mao. And so I think that people should realize that. China today is willing to sacrifice economic efficiency. It's willing to sacrifice its relationship in some cases with countries around the world in order to meet these political ideological goals.
Economic efficiency being sacrificed is also a precursor to not being able to meet the basic needs of your population. And I think you alluded to earlier that should that happen, I do ask the question, how long does the patience last? How long does tolerance last? Because you have to perform as a government. And at the end of the day, where China was 30, 40 years ago compared to today is night and day. So the population has gotten used to a standard of living, at least in certain parts of the country. I don't believe they're willing to give up for ideological purposes. So is he not walking a real tightrope with this?
I think he is. I think just to start, we should all be mindful of the fact that China is so much more powerful and does have the ability to be so much more independent and set its own policy than it ever did years ago. So, I mean, I went to China in the mid-90s, even before it entered the World Trade Organization. And China really wanted foreign money, foreign expertise. They welcomed foreign investors with open arms. And they made a lot of sacrifices and trade-offs for that. They opened up Chinese industries that had been largely closed, certainly been closed in the Mao, during Mao, but then had been closed in the first part of the reform process in China, which started in the late 70s. And so China really realized that it needed the expertise and help of the world. In an earlier financial crisis, well, much earlier, in about 2003, China dealt with real insolvency in its financial system, and they were trying to figure out what to do. They turned to the US. They invited over experts that had worked on something called the Resolution Trust Corps bailout in the US.
Right.
And they wanted to learn from the US, how do we deal with this challenge that we're facing now? And China did that in multiple ways over the years. You know, jump forward till today, world's second largest economy, on track, according to most economists' belief, to surpass the United States as the world's largest economy, world's largest trading nation. It has a lot of money. That's how they're able to do this tremendously impressive infrastructure build out they've done in recent years. So China is not the China that we knew before. Bob, I just say one other thing. I think that having said all that, I do think that there is what I refer to as a level of hubris in the Chinese government that they can manage, even if they alienate their partners and other economies and investors, they can still manage.
So I think about this, it's like, I wonder, like the teenagers coming into their early manhood or womanhood, and they're starting to look at the adults and they're feeling a little bit of their oats. I still think China has they look at the US still as the country they're competing with. And we're still number one in many respects, militarily, GDP, innovation, a number of different areas, but they're catching up fast. So I wonder how much, kind of the redheaded stepchild syndrome may exist. Great pride, as you have said often, in terms of the accomplishments. But I ask myself, are they not considering what their role is right now globally as it relates to what you just said? If they pull more inward, how does that help them with what their needs are going forward, which still is growth, expansion, and such? So I maybe this is not being framed in a proper way, but I still think that they have a little bit of just over exuberance in terms of where they stand right now, which can lead to bad decisions.
I think so. I mean, I think they are over exaggerating their ability to go it alone. I think, you don't create world-class technology by shutting yourself off from the world and closing down the internet, putting up the Great Firewall, and blocking off academic exchanges between universities around the world. I don't think that's a recipe for success. So I share your skepticism that they actually can pull this off.
China wants to become independent in terms of chips, the ability to make chips, which is a very difficult, very technologically advanced, and takes a lot of capital to build the foundries. They still have not been able to do that, so they're still dependent on. And I see that in many other levels too, where that dependency creates this tension for them. They want to be independent, but the reality is that always is not available to them for a number of different reasons. So I do question some of the policies of the current government. I think that time will tell whether these were thoughtful and actually resulted in good outcomes. My skepticism is right now that it does not, that it creates more problems. What do you hear from people internally within the country as a result of some of these crackdowns?
Yeah, what's interesting, I think overall there's, China has shut down its borders, unfortunately, for many families and people that work there. And it looks like they're going to keep the borders in effect shut until probably late next year, when they'll have a very important party congress where Xi Jinping, the leader, is planning to stay on for a third term, which is unprecedented. And so I think they're trying to wall themselves off from the pandemic, although they're having problems controlling the Delta variant. So I think the cost of that is very real. I think economically. But first of all, I think there is, and surveys have shown this, that there is real pride amongst the Chinese people, or there's this awareness that China actually has done a far better job in preventing fatalities, for example, with the pandemic. They have been able, for most of the period of COVID, other than a few months at the beginning of these draconian lockdowns, which we saw from afar, otherwise they've sort of returned to normal. And it's the cost of keeping the borders closed, keeping the pandemic out. But there is this pride in China. The state media, which is all controlled by the government, does a very good job of letting the Chinese people know about the problems that are outside its borders, particularly in the United States. Right. So they know all about every time that we hit a new milestone with fatalities in the US, with the pandemic, people in China are reading about that and they're saying, I'm glad I'm not in the United States. Mm-hmm. So the party is very mindful of that, and they're doing that very effectively. One of the reasons they need to do that is because they are facing real economic headwinds for a whole lot of reasons. Right. Demography, which you spoke about earlier, debt, which is the big Evergrand story, and also, to my mind, this backsliding or reversal on opening the economy, where, for example, there are these large crackdowns on private entrepreneurs, I think are going to have the effect of hurting the economy. I think they already are hurting.
You're talking about capital flows, both internally and externally within and outside the country. That's what we were alluding to earlier in terms of just perception. You can't sometimes quantify it, but it's real. So in kind of thinking about that, the previous administration had put unilateral trade sanctions against China. What were your thoughts when you saw this happening in terms of, was it well thought of? Did it consider the implications not only to our relations, but to businesses here within the United States as well? So any comments about sometimes what we may do as it relates to our own policy issues?
Well, I do give the previous administration credit for an overdue, to my mind, reckoning with the US-China relationship, recognition that things were not working in the way that always best suited the interests of the United States, which is obviously what the US government is trying to ensure happens. In terms of the tools, which was the trade war and sanctions, I think that was very misguided. And most importantly, it was a failure. I mean, China had record exports globally last year during the pandemic. A lot of it was selling things that people needed for people staying at home for the first time, for example, laptops and things, and a whole range of products. But anyway, China did very well. So the sanctions did not work. I think, again, I just say, yeah, I think it was, something needs to be done, I think there is a powerful mercantilist strain in Chinese economic policy making, which has only become stronger under the present leadership in Xi Jinping. And I don't think that's in the interests of other countries around the world. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have seen not just the US involved in trade spats with China, but pretty much everybody. The European Union, South Korea, Australia, notoriously. China has punished Australia by blocking exports of Australian wine and barley and wheat and lobster into China, simply because they, again, an example of how China views trade. It's seen as a tool. So in this case, Australia called for a investigation into the origins of COVID. What did China do? They turned their economic power on Australia, tried to punish them. So these disputes are very broad, and that is because of the fact that I do think China's not really playing by what other countries think are the global rules on trading and investment.
But we shouldn't expect these tensions to abate. This is something that I would expect will continue for years to come as countries jockey for position, try to get leverage.
Yeah, no, I have no, sadly, no hope that we're going to return to some halcyon days of yore. I think the tensions are very real. I think ultimately you have China, a rising nation with a lot of challenges, and you have the US, which has been in a bit of a rough spell, and quite naturally, the United States has no interest in seeing China sort of grab a larger portion of global influence and power. And that's going to continue to be a problem.
So a couple of weeks ago, we had a discussion led by Dr. Mirdad Key on Afghanistan. And one of the comments we had brought up was China's interest in Afghanistan as well as Russia because of the potential for vast mineral, oil, gas, copper, rare earth minerals, but the potential is vast within that country, but the infrastructure doesn't exist. China has a policy, or at least a stated policy, called the Belt and Road. Could you explain a little bit of that and how that kind of fits in with their domestic but external policies as well?
Yeah, the Belt and Road Initiative is very large. Some people have called it, some people have said it's sort of a Chinese version of the Marshall Plan after World War II. But there's a lot of money. It's focused on regions mainly close to China, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, into Africa. A lot of it is it's managed in a way that is beneficial to Chinese companies. So if China is funding, and they will fund a big infrastructure project, say in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia, say they're building a big new expressway, they will ensure that Chinese state enterprises are building that expressway, and they will ensure that Chinese banks are lending to are financing that project, and sometimes on relatively onerous terms. If the payment isn't paid back, in some cases, China has a right to seize assets. People have referred to China's Belt and Road as debt trap diplomacy, and I'm not sure that's completely fair. In the case of Afghanistan, more specifically, I think that China has very ambivalent attitude about what we've seen in recent months with the U.S. pullout. China indeed wants to and will take a larger role in Afghanistan going forward as now that the U.S. has pulled out. However, China is just as concerned about the possibility of Afghanistan becoming a base for global terrorism as the U.S. has been. And in their case, it relates to issues they see as separatism, or people trying to break away the far western mainly Muslim area of Xinjiang from China. And there have been the group that lives there, as you said, are the Uyghur Muslims. There have been Uyghur Muslims that have trained in Afghanistan and in some cases come back into this area of China, Xinjiang. Anyway, this I would say is the major concern for China. One last thing, I mean, China, there was talk a few years ago about how China was going to do so well in copper mining. There's a very large copper mine, I think it's Anyak, I'm mispronouncing that. But up to date, they've basically made no money off it, and it hasn't been developed. And that's because of the difficulty in carrying out big projects in such an unstable region mainly. So I think China is as much concerned in the case of Afghanistan about doing damage control, trying to ensure that it doesn't become a real base for terrorism or people that want to separate parts of China from China. And they're really not focused on big opportunities right now.
Right. So I have a number of questions, but I think this would be a good time to please let you, if you have some questions, go up to the mic, and we will leave the remaining time for those questions.
You might have to just speak
You
loudly.
may just have to be loud.
Except then the question might not be on Facebook.
So how do you see the future relations of China and Tibet?
So the question, thank you, Shang, one of my students. Thanks for being here. The question is, how do I see the future relations between China and Tibet? I think, I've been to Tibet a couple times, and I think I sort of I've been watching what unfolds there with great sadness. I think that China has accomplished much of its goals there, which are mainly about subduing the local population and ensuring that they don't try to push for a more independent Tibet. And I think they've been, again, sadly, largely effective there. The rest of the world is turned for very good reasons away from the issues in Tibet and focus more on Xinjiang because of the global human rights strategy that's been unfolding in Xinjiang with these re-education camps. But the fact of the matter is Tibet still has those tensions. There's serious conflicts over religion, the fact that most Tibetans worship the Dalai Lama, who the Chinese government officially calls, well, they call him a wolf in sheep's clothing, which they use colorful metaphors. They mean that he's pretending to be a sheep because he says he's pacifist and he wants nonviolence, but really he wants to split China, is what they believe, or at least what they say. So I think to your question, I think we will probably continue to see the status quo, which is China continuing to spread its hand, tighten its grip over Tibet, play a larger and larger economic role. The other thing that they've done very effectively, both in Xinjiang and Tibet, is, well, fairly effectively, is use migration of ethnic Chinese people who are mainly economic migrants looking for opportunity, but use that in order to, in effect, dilute the original ethnic population.
Thank you for very interesting and exciting presentation. I have a comment, and as you know, a comment was indirect question and a question also. First, you said that the reaction or the direction that Xi Jinping is taking now is mostly ideological. Yes and no. As you know, the Chinese are very pragmatic, and they let the capitalist machine go amok at high speed. With what does it produce? Wealth, of course, opportunities, about corruption and extreme inequalities, which are huge in China. Income inequalities and the corruption, which comes from private companies also. So there's a crackdown. Xi Jinping is going to the left. He's taking the helm of the boat towards the left, which you don't like to say that in the US, but it's not only ideological. So I want your reaction on that. And my second question directly, in Europe, there is a feeling that George Friedman, the analyst, for instance, that Biden is trying to replace the Cold War, the Russian-West Cold War, by a new Cold War between China and an Anglo-Saxon axis. As you know, I'm referring to the Australian crisis. So, because China they have been invaded by the West. They don't want to invade anything. They want to trade. So what is going on with this Anglo-Saxon prod to push for a new Cold War, which doesn't smell good?
So on your first point, yeah, I think there is tremendous challenges in China, and I think you could argue, it's not exactly capitalism, but yeah, capitalism has gone amok. There has been a huge challenge with corruption. The Communist Party itself is deeply riven with corruption, which was affecting its ability to govern. The wealth gap is on par with Russia, and it's growing as fast as Russia. It's one of the most unequal societies on earth. I have a book out last year called The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, which is on that very topic. I think it's very real. I think that Xi Jinping, as I said earlier, is a true believer who actually does not like to see that degree of inequality, that he actually does want to ensure that the people that have been left behind are no longer left behind. His biggest recent campaign was the battle against extreme poverty. My issue there is, I think, first of all, the way that he's going to battle it, I don't think necessarily is going to be long-term sustainable. For example, the battle against extreme poverty has been largely about population transfers, often forced population transfers, protests related to people that are being moved out of what China's policymakers see as inhospitable, economically unfeasible parts of China and put into these newly created cities. I've been to a lot of these poverty resettlement zones. It's not clear how they're going to function going forward. Right now, China, the government has money to support these people that are largely rural, uneducated, don't have a lot of skills outside agriculture, are being put in these high rises in many cases. I should note as well, the resettlement program has been riven with corruption. And this is Xi Jinping's signature program. He's been trying to crack down on the corruption, but it's been a huge opportunity for local governments to make money. I think there are better ways to do it. You know, the private sector is 80% of the, employs 80% of urban workers. It's by far the most dynamic part of the economy. They need a strong private sector if they're going to actually help more people get out of poverty. There are these policies I talk about in my book, which there's something called the household registration policy, the HUCO. It's a huge obstacle to actually creating a more equal society because it, in effect, keeps rural people as second-class citizens. And the government and Xi Jinping has shown no desire really to change that. So yes, I think there are real problems. Yes, there can be an argument made that they needed to step back. There is too much wealth. There's a lot of corruption in wealth. They should crack down on that. I'm not at all sure they're doing it in the right way. I don't think that walling themselves off from the world, and that is happening. You talk about in the second part, in Anglo-Saxon axis. Yeah, don't ever forget that decoupling is happening very much from that side as well. And they'll sometimes they speak about it openly and they publish it in their in English, and often they don't. But their internal speeches are about creating their own. They have targets to create their own products. They have there's a growing anti-foreign feeling in China and so on. This last thing. Yes, we have AUKUS, right? Australia and England, the United States. What a dastardly, terrible Anglo-Saxon conspiracy. We also have the Quad under Biden. Who's in the Quad? Yes, Australia and the U.S., the Anglo-Saxons. Then we have Japan and India. I mean, that's hardly an Anglo-Saxon conspiracy. This has been equally a part of Biden's strategy. It goes back pre-Biden. I don't think that we're seeing the beginning of an Anglo-Saxon conspiracy there. I just don't. And believe me, I look out for that stuff. I know there's a lot of I know it could happen. I just don't see it happening now.
You know, Tiff, there was a pact that we decided not to participate in with various Asian countries during the previous administration. So there's concerns amongst Asian neighbors of the rising power, both economically and militarily, of China. It's not just, as he points out, an Anglo-Saxon type of concern. So relations, and Biden spoke at the UN the other day, and I did not hear the entirety of his speech. I did hear him say he is not looking for a new Cold War with China, but I also hear too, he's reaching out to traditional and non-traditional allies of the US with the possibility that China on the rise is a threat in terms of at least economic cooperation or challenges as well. So I ask myself this question I have often. We may not be able to do as much about China politically or economically as we think. The corollary of that is getting your own house in order. If you were to close your eyes and listen to Xi Jinping or Bernie Sanders, would you know which one was speaking of specific problems to what country? I hear him speaking about issues that are front and center today. Income inequality are issues as it relates to too much wealth being concentrated in too few hands. Is it truly any different than what's happening in China, the US, and other parts of the world as well? Mirdad?
Just a comment that kind of turned the table around with Michelle's comments. It is the Shanghai Cooperation, right? The Shanghai Pact. One can also use the same argument on the other side to say that there is a Sino-centered, China-centered sort of cooperation which brings Russia, Central Asia,
Right.
Pakistan, Afghanistan, now Iran, kind of holding a periphery for China to create its own, European Union of some sort of economic zone where China is then trying to pick up. I wanted Tiff to comment on that as a counterbalance to other cooperation economic cooperation. But I also wanted to sort of comment or ask this. My very shallow observation of China is, I'm walking on the ruins of one of these, 19th century palaces outside Beijing. And there's an amphitheater, and there's a large Chinese audience there watching a movie. And the movie is about how the French and the British destroyed that beautiful palace. And every time, and I could not understand a word, of course, because I don't speak Chinese, but every time there was an insult thrown like by the British officers, there was this, this appalling reaction to how the Westerners have treated us. And then when the Chinese personages responded, there was applause. So I just felt that I'm not dealing with anything but a nationalist state with a nationalist ideology. It doesn't matter how much it claims to be communist. I think the dominant nationalist ideology, and it says that China, though it's a rising power, it has been always the victim of Western colonialism and imperialism. And I think that impulse, isn't it still there and shaping so much of the ideology you refer?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China, I don't think China's necessarily, I don't think they're trying to do an Asian, they're happy to work with anyone who'll stand by them, whether it's European or wherever it might be. And we've seen that with the Belt and Road Initiative as well. But yeah, to your second point, I think that, yes, I think this sense of nationalism is extremely important. They refer to, and every child in every school in China is taught about what they refer to as the century of national humiliation, which was the roughly 100 years around the Opium Wars, when the British, addicted most of the population on opium, and then some battles were fought, and then the colonial powers came in and set up extraterritoriality so that they had their own police forces and governments there. This is absolutely important to every Chinese. I mean, when Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949, he stood up above the square and above Tiananmen Square and said, "The Chinese people have stood up." And it was tremendously important. They've been through the century, what they call the century of national humiliation. They'd been through bloody civil war between the communists and the KMT, and then through Japanese occupation. And so this is integral to understanding what they're trying to do today as well. It's very much a part of the party as well. And it's completely understandable if you look at history. I do think that we have seen them use that nationalism effectively in order to bolster their own support. They also tend to use it in situations where they feel like otherwise the party may be under pressure. I think we need to be mindful of the fact that if the economy in China continues to slow, which I think it will, they will turn more and more towards nationalism to basically drum up support amongst the people of China, and it's very natural. I just one last thing, I just comes into my mind. I think it's interesting. A lot of people looking at China here, if they're of a certain mindset and a certain opinion of the world, will say, yes, China it is not expansionist. It's never gone beyond its borders. I find that hard to understand. I mean, first of all, they fought a bloody war and the Indians did their part in the Himalayas. They have contested territory there. They have contested territory with most of their neighbors. They have expanded seriously into the South China Sea, built up serious military naval presence there. They send jets across the unofficial halfway point of the Taiwan Strait on a weekly basis now that exceeds anything we've ever seen before, which is a sort of a gray warfare that they're carrying out with Taiwan. Now, of course, they'll say Taiwan belongs to us. There's a historical argument to be made Some people would make that maybe it does. I wouldn't make that argument. I would make the opposite argument. But he sort of ignores the fact that you've got about 20 million Taiwanese people in a functioning democracy who have shown very clearly they have no desire to be taken over by China. So is that expansionism? I would call that expansionism. So I just push back against that notion that China is expansionist. You look in the East China Sea with Japan. There's a reason why Japan is upset. And as Bob was saying earlier, it's not just the US, it's not just Anglo-Saxon countries. If you talk to diplomats, government officials from Southeast Asian countries, often they won't say it openly. If you talk to them privately, they will often express support for a larger and a continued strong US presence in the region because they're afraid, and they should be afraid, frankly.
So for the sake of brevity and time, the question of Taiwan actually came up from a Zoom. We'll allow this for the last question, then we'll be around for a few minutes and close this discussion. One question, how do you see the relations between China and Taiwan going forward? Also, what should the US be doing to ensure China does not continue to threaten Taiwan and its democracy? And I will add this, China has watched us with several other allies that we have treaties with in terms of coming to their assistance in the case of military action. So when they look at the US recent actions and not too distant past, put that into your equation as how that may look with the question.
I think China has made it abundantly clear that they have no interest in listening to the desires of the Taiwanese people, and that they want to, probably in the lifetime of Xi Jinping, take back Taiwan. And you look at what they did with Hong Kong with the national security law. They've shown that they are willing to pay an economic price and a price diplomatically just to achieve certain political goals. And it gets back to this issue of sovereignty and the history that they have. And Hong Kong was seen as a blot as well with the fact that it was controlled by the British. So they have little patience to listen to what actually the Hong Kong people or the Taiwanese people want. They're showing militarily, as I said earlier, with the flights, the PLA flights across the Taiwan Strait, that they they're testing Taiwan. They're using a large disinformation campaign to try to sow dissension amongst the Taiwanese population, convince them that the US won't stand by them, convince them that the Taiwanese government is incompetent, and prepare them for an eventual a reassertion of control by Beijing over Taiwan. So I'm quite pessimistic, about it. And I lived in Taiwan for 4 years. That's where I first went after I left college. I have a very soft spot in my heart for Taiwan. I think it doesn't look good. I think what the U.S. Should do is sort of what it's doing. I think there's been this policy of so-called strategic ambiguity that successive U.S. administrations have followed, which is we don't say clearly what we would do in the event of hostilities between Taiwan and China. I don't think that really works anymore. I think that there needs to be a more clear stating, including by the US government, of what the potential cost would be of an invasion of Taiwan by China. And so I think that's, Trump started sending these increasingly senior officials to Taiwan. I don't think that was necessarily a mistake. China will tell you this is the US warmongering. They're ratcheting up the tensions between us and Taiwan. I don't really buy that. I don't think that China, if we ratchet down the tensions, will China decide it doesn't want Taiwan back? I don't think so. They want Taiwan back. So I think that's not so bad. And one last thing I would say, which country has expressed most concern or unusual concern about China's stance towards Taiwan now, other than the US? Japan. Japan has. Japan, the prime minister, he met with Biden, I guess virtually, and stated that they were deeply concerned about the Taiwan situation. Japan knows that they run the risk of being pulled into any conflict between the US and China over Taiwan. They also have a long history. I mean, Taiwan was a Japanese colony. There's big business for Japan in Taiwan. And so there's a long relationship there. So yeah, I'll just stop there.
It's complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it can spin off into many other discussions, but for time's sake, I want to thank all of you for coming here today. We'll be here for a few minutes afterwards if you have any questions, comments. So thank you all on Zoom, World Affairs Council, Dr. Mirdad Kia, of course, and his support. So for all of you, have a good day and thank you.